Gen X might be the only generation that grew up unsupervised and then became obsessed with supervision. These were the kids who let themselves into empty houses after school. No cell phones, no tracking apps, just a sticky note on the fridge and a rule: be home before dark. They rode bikes without helmets, disappeared for hours, and learned early that if something broke, you fixed it or lived with it. And yet, somehow, the so-called latchkey kids grew up to check location apps, worry about screen time, and ask their children how they're feeling. The generation raised on quiet independence became the generation of emotional check-ins. So what happened? Is Gen X parenting a rebellion against their own childhood, a psychological correction, or something deeper, an imprint left by growing up alone just long enough to feel it? Let's unpack that paradox. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, Gen X grew up in a world that felt unstable. Divorce rates were climbing. Dual-income households became common. The Cold War hovered like background static. Economic recessions shaped dinner table conversations. This was the era of MTV, arcade games, and cable television babysitters. Many kids walked home alone, made their own snacks, and figured out homework without much adult oversight. The term latchkey kid wasn't an insult, it was a demographic reality. From a psychological standpoint, this environment fostered early autonomy. Attachment research, like the foundational work of John Bowlby, suggests that inconsistent supervision can create self-reliance, but also emotional distance. You learn to regulate yourself because you have to. Gen X internalized one message early: handle it. That built resilience, but it also left quiet spaces, unspoken feelings, unprocessed fears, a sense of figuring life out solo. And those silent afternoons would later shape how they raised their own children. Here's the tension. Gen X is proud of its toughness, but they don't want their kids to feel the loneliness that sometimes came with it. They remember walking into dark houses. They remember not wanting to bother their parents. And even if they turned out fine, mostly, they still carry the emotional echo of that independence. So now, as parents, they live in contradiction. Part of them believes struggle builds character. Another part wants to prevent unnecessary pain. They'll say, figure it out, but stay close enough to catch the fall. They'll preach independence, then text, did you get there? Psychology calls this compensatory behavior, when we adjust our actions to avoid repeating what felt lacking in our own upbringing. There's also cognitive dissonance at play. They value grit, yet they've learned the importance of emotional validation. They're not rejecting their childhood, they're editing it. And that internal editing process is what defines Gen X parenting more than any stereotype ever could. If we zoom out, the pattern becomes clearer. One useful lens is attachment theory. Children who grow up with moderate emotional distance often develop avoidant coping strategies, self-sufficiency, low reliance on others. That's not dysfunction, it's adaptation. But when those children become parents, sometimes they aim for a more secure attachment dynamic with their own kids, more emotional attunement, more responsiveness. That's compensatory parenting in action. There's also the psychology of risk perception. Studies have shown that modern media environments amplify perceived danger. Gen X grew up in a relatively analog world. Now they parent in a hyper-connected one. When every news alert highlights worst-case scenarios, vigilance increases. It's not paranoia, it's cognitive bias shaped by constant exposure. Self-determination theory adds another layer. Humans thrive when three needs are met: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Gen X had autonomy and competence in spades, relatedness less consistently. So as parents, they try to balance all three for their children. They encourage independence, but they also create emotional availability. They normalize therapy. They talk about anxiety. They don't see resilience and emotional literacy as opposites. They see them as upgrades. Compare that to the generations around them. Boomer parents often leaned authoritarian, because I said so. Emotional expression wasn't discouraged outright, but it wasn't prioritized. Discipline came first. Feelings came later, if at all. Millennial parents, on the other hand, are often identity-centered and emotionally fluent. They emphasize validation, boundaries, and mental health language. Conversations about feelings are front and center. Gen X sits between those poles. They don't fully embrace the rigid authority model, but they're also skeptical of over-curation and constant intervention. They value self-reliance. They want their kids to try, fail, and recover. At the same time, they're more likely than their parents were to say, "Talk to me, what's going on?" In discipline, they often favor authoritative over authoritarian styles, clear rules but explained, consequences but with context. You'll see it in small moments. A Gen X parent might let their teenager navigate a social conflict alone, but debrief afterward. They won't fight every battle for their child, but they won't disappear either. They are, in many ways, translators, bridging emotional eras. Now, layer in technology. Gen X is the first truly analog generation raising fully digital children. They remember life before the internet. Their kids don't. That creates friction. They understand privacy instinctively because they had it. No one documented their awkward phases online. So they're cautious about social media. They worry about algorithms, cyberbullying, and digital permanence. At the same time, they're pragmatic. They adapt. They learn the apps. They try to set boundaries instead of banning everything outright. Sociologists sometimes refer to cultural lag when technological change outpaces social norms. Gen X parents are living inside that lag. They're negotiating screen time rules in real time. Their protectiveness isn't just about control. It's about navigating a world that moves faster than the one they were prepared for. And in that speed, they lean into what they know best: adaptability. When you step back, Gen X parenting isn't contradictory, it's adaptive. They took the grit of their childhood and kept it. They took the emotional gaps and tried to close them. They don't romanticize struggle, but they don't fear it either. There's strength in that middle ground. Research on post-traumatic growth suggests that people often build wisdom from earlier adversity, not by erasing it, but by integrating it. That's what Gen X parents are doing. They're integrating independence with emotional presence. They're raising kids who can survive and talk about how survival feels. Quiet resilience, open conversation, fewer empty houses, more check-ins. Not perfect, but intentional. And sometimes intention is the real generational shift. If you grew up with Gen X parents, or you are one, take a second and reflect. What did they keep from their childhood? What did they change? Drop your experience in the comments. Let's map the pattern together, because understanding where we came from might be the first step in deciding where we're going next.